Hi folks, I'm Father Joe Grimaldi. You can call me Joe, and I'd like to welcome you to my podcast. But now, here's our host and friend, Ken Calvert.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the Father Joe Grimaldi podcast. I'm Ken Calvert along with Father Joe Grimaldi. The Father Joe podcast is proudly supported by Hoot McInerney Star Lincoln, 12 Mile Road and Telegraph in Southfield. The Spring Savings Sales event is going on now, but only until May 31st. Star Lincoln has added incredible one-time only dealer incentives that most likely will never be repeated. Check out these additional incentive enhancements available to all current Lincoln and Ford owners. You'll get $2,000 additional savings on the 2019 MKZ. You'll get $1,500 on the 2019 MKC. $500 cash back on the 2019 Nautilus, the hottest SUV on the road. And coming in any day, it's the all-new Lincoln Aviator, the star of the North American International Auto Show. In a hurry? Shop online at starlincoln.com or call us 248-354-4900. Hoot McInerney Star Lincoln, 12 Mile and Telegraph in Southfield, home of the Star Treatment. Well, unfortunately, our dear friend Father Joe is unable to be with us today. You see, on Monday, Father Joe received a new hip. Never one to complain, the good Father was tolerating a great deal of pain. Unfortunately for all of us, he's doing really well, and he'll more than likely be away for a couple of weeks. So what we'd like to do is feature a few podcasts that prompted the most response from you, the listeners, to the podcast. On today's podcast, for example, we're going to take you back to early January of this year when we discussed the millennial generation and their views regarding not only the Catholic Church, but personal faith and Christianity. Pew Research defines millennials as anyone born between 1981 and 1996. And that would put their ages between the ages of 23 and 38 here in 2019. So in 2019, anyone aged 23 to 38 is considered to be a millennial. So let's take a look back and listen to the Father Joe podcast. Father Joe, Ken Calvert, talking about the millennials and how they're approaching Christianity, the Catholic Church, and their faith. My wife, one of our biggest fans.
I think that's great.
She said to me today, actually she called me on the road and said, I have an idea for a podcast. I just heard something on WWJ, the news radio station here locally in Detroit, and they were talking about millennials no longer going to church. And you and I brought up a quick fact check here. Why millennials are really leaving religion, it's not just politics. The number of Americans ages 18 to 29 who have no religious affiliation has nearly quadrupled in the last 30 years. Think about that. Do you notice that in the ranks when you're saying Mass?
Definitely. I think this is a big hot topic, if you want, today, because the numbers are dwindling in all of the mainstream churches, so that Catholicism is among those mainline churches. In any case, people are substituting spiritualism as opposed to religion. And what I mean by that, they're rejecting any type of organized religion, but they do believe in a higher being, and therefore they are spiritualists. And so it's an interesting way to look at it, because some people say they're not rejecting religion. They're rejecting organized religion. And so they feel that they can communicate with their God at home. What happens is the church offers something that we cannot find when we're without an organized religion. And what I mean by that is the church offers a support system, because when we're in church and we're worshiping and we see all these other people doing the same thing, it gives me the courage to continue to worship. Mm-hmm. If we are by ourselves, we could easily just give up the whole thing and not bother. I think that the spiritualists don't even have to do any worshiping. They just believe, and I may be wrong, I'm not an expert in this field, but I think that they believe that there is a higher being, and they want to respond to that higher being in their own way, whatever that is. Some do it this way, some do it that way. There's no particular organized way of doing it. But they do not want to be bothered by any type of organized religion where you have to go in and register.
They don't want to be tied down by the fact that on Sunday they have to put this on their calendar,
right,
and make space to go to a Catholic church mass at 10 a.m. to fulfill the obligation.
And they don't want to register. They don't want to be called upon. They don't want to feel that they have to participate so that their children will be accepted into the Catholic schools, because many people like going to the Catholic schools, particularly for discipline and for education. Mm-hmm. They do a good job, generally speaking, and so people like that. And very often, people go to the church so that they could easily get their children into that particular Catholic school, wherever it may be. But they don't want to be an enlisted member, if you want.
They don't want to be bogged down by the responsibility that comes with being a member of an organized church.
Correct. Yeah,
okay. So let me play devil's advocate.
Yes.
And what's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that.
And again, I'm just playing the part of the millennial who can go to yoga and meditate and stretch and exercise and do something healthy and think about God.
Yeah, I would say this, though, that the thing is this, that they're lacking the idea of worship. There is a need in the human person to worship. And going to a church allows you to get the support of the other people that are there to do your worship properly. There's hymn singing, there's Bible study, there's all of these different things that they can participate in. Besides, for Catholics, there would be the Mass. Well, all of the mainstream religions have a ritual that they follow. It's interesting, people like the idea of having a ritual. They miss that when they leave the Catholic Church or the mainstream religion. They miss that ritual. For example, for Catholics, a very important part of the Mass is communion.
The Eucharist.
The Eucharist. Mm-hmm. And some people miss that after they leave. They want to come back just for that. They don't want the other stuff, but they do need the Eucharist. Huh? So there are things that one can gather from going to a ritual that's not given this freewheeling identity with the higher being, whatever that may be.
Do you resent the fact that there are other opportunities out there for the sake of this podcast, millennials opting out for? In other words, other areas that they can feel fulfilled and yet at the same time consider themselves to have Christian values and belief in a Christian way.
I don't resent it at all. I do believe that God works with people in different ways. Different people are ready to accept God on their terms. Sometimes out of ignorance, and I don't mean that in a negative sense,
right,
not knowing if you want, but other times they feel better doing what they're doing. The question I have is this: are they being sincere, or are they just trying to get away from doing something? I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does.
If someone is really sincere, that they're benefiting more from being a spiritualist, I could understand that. But if they're just trying to get away from the obligation of attending some type of ritual, or because I'm speaking not just of Catholics here, but all mainstream churches have a ritual that they follow, and some people don't want to be bothered with that. And so it's a nice way to say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm a spiritualist. I don't need to do that.
Yeah.
So if they're not being honest about it, then I think there's something wrong with it. If they are being honest about it and that they are sincere about what they're doing and the road that they're following, who am I to judge? I don't know. I can't judge. I would say let's wait and see what happens.
Yeah, and you're probably not going to be able to do anything about it if that's the way they feel.
Yes.
Now, perhaps later down the road, they'll find the need to come back to some sort of organized religion in the Catholic Church. As we've talked about many times, I mean, there's an entire website devoted to Catholics Come Home, appealing to people to come back and see what's going on and what maybe you're missing. But going back to the millennials, when you talk about that sort of a loss with that generation, 4 times quadrupled in terms of numbers, losing those numbers, what's the genesis of that?
I don't know, but I would say that maybe the scandals have had something to do with it. Why bother if the priests themselves are not following the rules? They're generalizing in that sense. But the other thing I noticed, too, about the millennials, and I think I'm talking about the millennials, I'm thinking of people from 20 to 40, basically. And what's interesting is this. When it comes time for someone to baptize their child, that brings them back, at least for a while, because that's important to them. When it comes time to bury the dead, that brings them back. Even though they don't practice, they want the Christian burial. So it's, there's an old saying, and I don't mean to make light of the whole things, is hatched, matched, and dispatched.
Yeah.
So many Catholics, or would-be Catholics, so many people believe in when you're baptized, when you get married, and when you're buried. Those are the 3 times you go to church. And so it's hatched, matched, and dispatched. But basically, I know it's...
I don't mean to laugh either, but...
I know.
But it makes sense, yeah.
That's what people joke about.
The millennial mantra might be hatched, matched, and dispatched, right?
Yeah, I think that's what's happening a lot. They don't...
And I'm not bad-rapping it at all, by the way. I'm not passing judgment on anyone or anyone's beliefs. This is just for the sake of our conversation and our podcast.
But the onus now, I think, is on the ministers to make it appealing enough so that people would want to come on a regular basis. The numbers are dwindling. There is no question about it. I notice it, and you speak to my Protestant friends, they notice it. So it's happening everywhere. It's not just Catholicism. It's happening in all of the mainstream religions. I think what may be growing, and I may be mistaken on this, would be the evangelical churches. When they do this loud worship and so on and so forth, they like that. That's something that keeps their interest. I'm not sure.
Well, it could be a daytime event. I mean, it's basically Sunday you go, and there may be the garden. There may be some activities for the children. There may be some singing. Then there's some practical interpretation of the Bible, but it's an event. It's kind of like going to, something that might be at one of the various show places, like even an auto show. It's a day-long event.
I agree with you, but it's interesting that once it becomes freewheeling, in the sense that they just appear on this particular Sunday when they have the music that they listen to and some even exercise and healthy things and interpretation of the Bible and so on and so forth. Once it becomes so freewheeling, they don't feel that they have an attachment to something. But it's interesting that I would every so often would get one of them coming to me and speaking in private and saying, is it wrong for me to come back regularly because I miss communion? Mm-hmm. And my response to that is, you really have to make a decision whether it's going to be one thing or the other.
Stopping you here. Can't do both?
You can't, really. I mean, you can't do both with any type of integrity, huh? Just doesn't work that way. I mean, you can't just go to like a smorgasbord, a buffet or something.
That's what we were saying. I mean, What is the Catholic Church doing about it? Doing about the loss, the numbers that are dwindling?
The Catholic Church is doing whatever it usually has been doing. Is
Are
trying
you
to energize.
actively talking about
Definitely.
the loss of
no,
numbers?
definitely.
Okay. Yeah.
Definitely. That certainly seems to be a topic among the bishops. What can we do to energize the church again? I don't know if it will ever be energized the way it was at one time. The church did a lot of wonderful things in the past. I mean, things that went beyond the ritual of the church. For example, education. Look at the education system of the whole 20th century, the 1900s, the late 1800s. It was the church that provided that education, that, how should I put it, steady, faithful education, not just for religion now. Mm-hmm. People went there because they could get a solid education. Non-Catholics would go on a regular basis because they felt they could get a very solid education. The educational system that the church provided in the past, well, you could look at the various people who are prominent in the world today that are not necessarily Catholic, but they had a background in Catholic school education, which
right.
we sometimes make fun of, but yet it offered a very steady place for people to be. And from there, they were able to jut off into whatever fields they went to.
Yeah, the Catholic universities, for example.
Oh.
There's nothing finer. Well, again, that's subjective from my point of view. If the first check mark you have to make on your application is, I'm a practicing Catholic, well, they'd be out of business. That speaks volumes to what you were just saying about going back, and not that far, going back 50 years. Just 50 years, and my, how things have changed.
I like what you're saying there, Ken. I do. It's interesting to me, though, that many of these millennials that do not practice a particular organized religion, when it comes to education, they want to send their children to the Catholic school or to a school that's similar to that.
Why? Why do you think they do that?
A combination of things.
Uh-huh.
They do still regard the discipline to be a good thing. Then the discipline of learning. They do believe that they offer a challenge. These private schools are so expensive that the alternative is the Catholic school, who are trying to make it available to as many people as possible, the education, and so that it offers them the possibility of having this private school atmosphere without having to spend $25,000 a year to go to high school. I mean, so it's working both ways, let me put it this way. Now, hopefully, we as a church, I say we as a priest, as a church, can give example, because very often actions speak louder than words.
I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is this, that if we can give a strong example of how to live the Christian life, hopefully, while they're there just for the education aspect of it, maybe they will get a sense of what it means to be a follower of Christ.
We could honestly do a full hour on this. There are so many angles right now that I would like to go in, but we just don't have the time to do it. I would love to have somebody come in and represent that side of the argument.
So would I.
And I'm going to recommend that either you or I find that person and let them explain it to us.
I would like that.
Okay. All right.
I'm going to actively look for someone. You know, I think one of the things people have to realize that regardless of what happens, if we are true Christians, we're supposed to be ambassadors of Christ.
Yeah.
And that we carry out in whatever role we play in the world. So if people are using some of the church's opportunities, these millennials, let's say the educational system, well, those people that are running that school or the education system should be active ambassadors of Christ. This way, the people might get the sense of what it means to truly follow Christ, and maybe would become more conscious of attending church on a regular basis so they could get the support of other Christians.
We had a nice discussion here about this.
We did.
Are we getting old?
Yes.
With that said, ladies and gentlemen, hope you enjoyed the program. I'm Ken Calvert along with Father Joe Grimaldi. We'll see you next time on the Father Joe Grimaldi podcast.
Look forward to it. This is Father Joe Grimaldi, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Father Joe podcast.
If you'd like, you can email us. It's frjoepodcast@gmail.com. That's frjoepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook. Simply search Father Joe Grimaldi. And thanks for listening, everyone.